The Apache war cry shattered the dawn like a scream torn from the throat of hell itself. Nora Walsh pressed her back against the crumbling adobe wall Thomas clutched to her breast as bullets splintered the wooden shutters around her. Through the gaps, she glimpsed painted faces streaked with war paint rifle barrels glinting in the early light, death riding hard through the morning mist. "Danny, you promised," she whispered to the empty air, her voice lost beneath the thunder of hooves. She could still hear his last words before he'd ridden away. "I'll come back with enough gold to buy you a palace, Nora. Our boy will want for nothing." Now Thomas was dying in her arms, his tiny chest barely rising with each shallow breath. The raiders swept past like a desert cyclone, their attention fixed on the Morrison homestead, where gunfire had erupted in desperate defense. Nora could hear Sarah Morrison's screams, the crash of burning timber, the final shots that marked another family's extinction. The silence that followed was broken only by the crack of cooling wood and the patient circling of vultures overhead. Thomas stirred weakly, his lips blue as winter sky. 3 days since her milk had dried up when fever racked her body. 3 days of watching him fade, of giving him nothing but sandy water that tasted of desperation. His fingers, once so strong they could grip her thumb with fierce determination, now lay open and still. "Our boy will want for nothing." She repeated Daniel's promise like a prayer. But their boy wanted everything now: milk, warmth, the simple gift of another sunrise. The desert stretched endlessly beyond her shattered door, beautiful and merciless, painted in shades that reminded her of dried blood. A shadow fell across the threshold. Nora's breath caught as she saw him, an Apache warrior on horseback, sitting motionless 30 yards from her cabin. Younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with intelligent dark eyes and scars mapping a history of violence. His rifle lay across his saddle, ready, but not aimed. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, they stared at each other across the chasm that separated their worlds. Then he dismounted with fluid grace, approaching with empty hands visible. "Your child dies," he said in careful English, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Not a question. A statement of fact that cut through her heart like a blade. Nora found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Yes." The warrior studied her face, reading something there that made him reach into a leather pouch. He withdrew a bundle wrapped in soft doeskin, placed it on the ground between them, and stepped back without breaking eye contact. "From one who has lost everything," he said quietly, "to one who need not." 6 months ago, Nora Walsh had been a woman drunk on dreams and Daniel's promises. They'd arrived in Arizona territory with nothing but hope and calloused hands, staking their claim on the knife's edge of Apache country, where land was cheap because survival was expensive. "This is where we'll build our empire," Daniel had declared, his arms sweeping across the harsh landscape. "Our son will inherit something worth having." Thomas had come with the spring rains during those blessed days when the desert bloomed in defiance of its own cruelty. Daniel had held his son with wonder, whispering grand plans, while Nora dozed in exhausted contentment. For those perfect weeks, their future had seemed inevitable as sunrise. But the wagon train had changed everything. Gold-fevered men with California dreams and silver tongues had filled Daniel's head with tales of fortunes waiting in riverbeds. Despite Nora's tears, despite Thomas's need, Daniel had chosen the promise of easy wealth over the harder path of building something lasting. "Mrs. Green will look after you," he'd sworn, kissing her forehead as Thomas nursed. "I'll return before the snow flies rich enough to buy you both the world." The only word since had come from a trader who claimed to have seen Daniel heading west with some rough boys. The man had reeked of whiskey and desperation, but his words had planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger with each silent sunrise. Now, as Nora unwrapped the warrior's gift, she discovered goat's milk still warm from the animal honey in a small clay pot, and bark bearing symbols she couldn't read, but whose meaning was clear: live. Let your child live. She fed Thomas drop by precious drop, watching color return to his lips like dawn breaking over the desert. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face for the first time in days. The sound he made wasn't the weak mewling of starvation, but something approaching contentment. Over the following days, gifts appeared each morning. Milk, medicine, water that tasted of mountain springs. The warrior never showed himself again, but Nora felt his presence like a guardian shadow. Thomas grew stronger, his cries becoming the lusty protests of health rather than the whispered complaints of the dying. When Mrs. Green finally returned, driving her supply wagon through the dangerous dawn, her relief at finding them alive was matched only by her horror at learning who had saved them. "A Tahoma," she whispered, her weathered face going pale. "Dear God, it has to be Tahoma. You know him, know of him. War chief to Cochise's nephew, they say. Leads raids from the dragoons to the Mexican border." Mrs. Green settled heavily into the cabin's single chair. "But there are stories. They say he lost a child once, a son taken by fever. Some claim it broke something in him, made him capable of—" She struggled for words. "Unexpected mercy." "What do you mean?" "Last winter, a family was caught in a blizzard up in the high country. Father froze to death, left his wife and twin babies with no food, no fire. Should have died, all of them. But someone kept leaving supplies, milk, blankets, medicine. When the rescue party found them, they discovered Apache sign everywhere." Mrs. Green's eyes were distant with memory. The woman swore she'd seen a warrior watching over them, keeping them alive. "And you think it was this Tahoma?" "I think grief makes people do strange things. Sometimes it drives them to cruelty." Mrs. Green looked at Thomas, now sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle. "Sometimes it drives them to grace." The warning in her words proved prophetic. That very night, as Nora fed Thomas by lamplight, she heard the distant thunder of approaching horses. Many horses moving fast and hard. Through the window, she could see torches flickering like fallen stars against the darkness. Voices carried on the night wind, speaking of justice and retribution. The sound of her name being called made her blood run cold. "Nora Walsh." The shout echoed off the canyon walls, and she recognized the voice with a mixture of relief and dread. Seth Walsh, Daniel's older brother, had finally come calling. She wrapped Thomas in his blanket and stepped outside to face judgment. Seth sat his horse like a man carved from stone, and fury taller than Daniel, broader in the shoulders, with the same green eyes, but none of his younger brother's easy charm. Behind him rode a dozen men from Copper Ridge, their faces grim as undertakers in the torchlight. "Seth," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What brings you here?" "Justice," he replied, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Something that's been in short supply lately." "I don't understand." "Don't you?" Seth dismounted with predatory grace, his hand never straying far from the colt at his hip. Dead families scattered across the territory. Homesteads burned, children orphaned. Yet here you sit, healthy and well-fed, while good people lie rotting in their graves. The accusation hit her like a physical blow. "You think I'm working with them? I think you're alive when you should be dead. I think that baby in your arms is fat and happy while other children starve. I think you've made some kind of arrangement with the very devils who've been butchering our people." Mrs. Green appeared beside her, rifle in hand. "That's enough, Seth Walsh. You've got no right to come here making wild accusations." "Well, wild." Seth's laugh was harsh as grinding stone. "My brother's been dead for 6 weeks, Mrs. Green. Shot down like a dog by territorial law for crimes I'm still trying to understand. His wife's been living off charity from the same savages who killed half the territory. Tell me what's wild about connecting those dots. Daniel's dead. The words escaped Nora's lips like a prayer torn from a dying throat. Seth produced a folded telegram from his coat. Territorial Marshal's Office. Positive identification from a wanted poster. Nora's hands shook as she read the stark message. Daniel Walsh, wanted for armed robbery, killed resisting arrest in Tombstone. Buried in Potter's Field grave, unmarked. No, she whispered, but the word carried no conviction. He's been dead since before you claim he left for California. Seth continued, his voice growing harder. Which means every story you've told yourself is a lie. And if you're lying about that. Before he could finish, the night exploded in violence. Muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers in the darkness as Apache warriors materialized from the shadows. War cries split the air as bullets whined past their heads with the sound of angry hornets. Down! Seth shouted, grabbing Nora's arm as his men scrambled for cover. But even as he moved to protect her, his eyes held accusation. The timing was too convenient, too perfect. The battle was brief but savage. Apache fighters struck from 3 directions, using darkness and terrain to deadly advantage. When the shooting stopped, 3 of Seth's men lay dead, and the survivors huddled behind whatever cover they could find. In the sudden silence, a voice called out, "Enough blood for one night." The same warrior who had saved Thomas stepped into the firelight, his rifle lowered, but ready. Behind him, other figures moved in the shadows, a war party that had appeared from the desert like phantoms made flesh. Tahoma, Seth spat. "I should have known you'd be here." "You know nothing," Tahoma replied calmly. "You come like children making noise in the dark, disturbing the peace with your accusations and threats." "Peace?" Seth's voice cracked with fury. "What would you know about peace? You're a killer, a butcher of families." "I am a man who has killed in war," Tahoma corrected. "As have you. As have all men when their people are threatened. But I have never killed innocents for sport or profit." "Then what about the Morrison family? What about the Hendersons? What about your brother?" Tahoma's voice cut through Seth's rage like a blade. "What about Daniel Walsh and his true crimes?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Seth's face went white, then red with fresh fury. "You lying bastard, Daniel was a good man, a dreamer maybe, but Daniel Walsh was a traitor to both our peoples," Tahoma said quietly. "A man who sold information to outlaws, who betrayed his neighbors for silver, who marked his own wife and child for death to protect his secrets. That's impossible." "Is it?" Tahoma's smile was cold as winter stars. "Then explain why your brother's homestead was never touched by raiders. Explain why he knew which routes were safe, which supplies were moving when. Explain why he left his family in the most dangerous place possible while he went to collect payment for his betrayals." Seth looked around wildly, seeking support from his men, but their faces showed only confusion and growing doubt. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. "You're lying," Seth whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I, or are you finally ready to hear the truth about the man you've been mourning?" The truth came in the form of letters hidden beneath loose floorboards in Daniel's cabin. Nora read them by lamplight, while armed men waited in tense silence, her world crumbling with each damning line. The first was addressed to a man named Cortez in Tucson. "Supply train leaves Copper Ridge on the 15th. 6 wagons light guard, silver from the Dragoon mines. Hit them at Devil's Canyon. 20% is agreed." The second letter was worse, dated just days before Daniel's supposed departure. "Situation becoming unstable. Apache raids getting attention from territorial authorities. Need to relocate assets before they become liabilities. If something happens to me, make sure wife and child don't survive to answer questions." Apache raid would be perfect cover, but it was the third letter that broke her heart completely. This one was different, unfinished, written in Daniel's increasingly desperate hand. Nora, I've made terrible mistakes. Cortez and his men are planning something that goes too far. I never meant for families to die, never meant for children to suffer. I'm going to Tombstone to try to stop this, to make things right. If I don't come back, know that I tried to. The letter ended abruptly, ink-blotted, as if the writer had been interrupted. But it was signed at the bottom. Your loving husband, who finally remembered what matters most. Nora set the letters aside with shaking hands. He tried to stop them, she whispered. At the end, he tried to make it right, and they killed him for it. Tahoma said quietly. His own partners put a bullet in his back when he tried to grow a conscience. Seth studied the letters, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally, a kind of broken understanding. The son of a bitch was going to get you killed to save his own neck. But he changed his mind, Nora insisted. He was coming back for us. And was he? Or was he just trying to save his own worthless hide? Before anyone could answer, Mrs. Green stepped forward with something that made everyone freeze. In her weathered hands was another letter, this one sealed and addressed to Nora, in Daniel's familiar script. I found this in my mailbox 3 days ago, she said quietly. Postmarked from Tombstone the day before Daniel died. Been afraid to give it to you, afraid of what it might say. Nora's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small object wrapped in cloth. The letter was brief. My dearest Nora, by the time you read this, I'll be dead or worse. I've done terrible things, betrayed people I should have protected, put you and Thomas in danger I never meant to create. Cortez has men watching you, waiting for any sign that you know about my activities. I've tried to call them off, but they don't trust me anymore. The enclosed key opens a safety deposit box at the Territorial Bank in Tucson. Inside, you'll find enough money to start over somewhere safe, somewhere far from the mess I've made. I love you more than my own life, which is why I'm going to sacrifice it to keep you safe. Tell Thomas his father was a fool, but he loved his family more than his own worthless dreams. Daniel. The wrapped object was indeed a key, small and brass, worn smooth by countless hands. Nora stared at it, torn between grief and fury, love and betrayal. He did love us, she said finally. In his way at the end, he did love us. Love. Seth's voice was harsh with pain. This isn't love, Nora. This is guilt. This is a man trying to buy his way out of hell with blood money. Maybe, she agreed. But it's also a man trying to save his family the only way he knew how. The moment was shattered by a new sound, horses approaching fast from the south. But these weren't the measured hoofbeats of cavalry or the wild rush of raiders. These were Apache ponies, moving with the fluid grace of riders born to the saddle. My grandfather comes. Tahoma said, his voice carrying a note of reverence. He has heard the gunfire and comes to see what has transpired. The old chief who emerged from the darkness was like something from another age, tall and dignified, despite his years, his weathered face marked by the scars of countless battles. He surveyed the scene with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of countless dreams. Grandson, he said to Tahoma in accented English, what have you done here? I have tried to save innocence, grandfather. I have tried to break the cycle of revenge that has consumed us all. The old chief's gaze moved to Nora, taking in her tear-stained face, the baby in her arms, the letters scattered at her feet. And what have you learned from this attempt? That sometimes the greatest mercy is knowing when to stop fighting. Tahoma replied. That sometimes the highest honor is in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Even when those people are your enemies, especially then, grandfather. For that is when mercy costs the most and therefore means the most. The old chief nodded slowly, his ancient eyes reflecting the dying torchlight. You have grown wise, my grandson. Perhaps it is time for this old man to grow wise as well. He turned to address Seth and his men, his voice carrying the authority of one who had led his people through decades of war and peace. I am called Cochise, he said. Not the great war chief you may have heard of, but his cousin and chief of the Chiricahua band. I have come to speak of endings. What kind of endings? Seth asked suspiciously. The ending of this war between our peoples. The ending of the cycle of violence that has consumed too many of our children. The ending of the hatred that has poisoned both our worlds. And what would you have us do? Forget the dead? Pretend the raids never happened? I would have you remember the dead by protecting the living. Cochise replied. I would have you honor the fallen by ensuring their children grow up in a world where such violence is no longer necessary. The old chief's words hung in the air like a challenge. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the desert, their voices carrying ancient songs of survival and adaptation. The territorial government seeks peace. Cochise continued. They offer reservations, boundaries, an end to the fighting. Many of my people resist this, seeing it as surrender. But I have lived long enough to know the difference between surrender and survival. And what about justice? Seth demanded. What about punishment for those who've committed crimes? What about it? Cochise's smile was sad and knowing. Will killing more people bring back the dead? Will spilling more blood heal the wounds of the past? Or will it simply create new wounds for the next generation to inherit? The question hung unanswered in the desert air. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Green stepped forward. There's something else you all need to know, she said quietly. Something I should have told you long ago. She looked directly at Tahoma, her weathered face creased with a mixture of gratitude and long-held guilt. 5 years ago, I was traveling to Tucson to collect my husband's pension. Got lost in a sandstorm, wandered for 3 days without water. Should have died out there, but someone found me, an Apache warrior who gave me water, guided me to safety, asked for nothing in return. She paused, her voice growing stronger. That warrior was you, wasn't he, Tahoma? You saved my life once, and I never even knew your name. Tahoma's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. I remember. You were crying, calling for your husband. I could not leave you to die alone. That's why you've been helping Nora. Mrs. Green continued. Not just because you lost a child, but because you've been helping me help her. You've been working through me to keep them alive. The revelation sent a ripple of shock through both groups. Here was another layer of complexity, another thread in the web of connection that bound their fates together. Is this true? Seth asked. It is true, Tahoma admitted. Mrs. Green has been my intermediary. She has brought supplies to the cabin, shared information about the family's needs. I have simply provided resources and protection from a distance. Why? Nora asked. Why go to such lengths to help strangers? Tahoma was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the dying firelight. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of profound loss. Because the last white family I tried to help betrayed me to the cavalry. They took my assistance, my protection, my trust. Then they told the soldiers where to find my camp. My son died in the attack that followed, killed by men who had eaten at my fire just days before. The confession hit like a physical blow. Here was the source of his pain and the reason for his internal war between mercy and vengeance. I swore I would never help a white family again, he continued. But when I saw you with your dying child, I remembered my own son, my own helplessness. I could not let another child die when I had the power to prevent it, even though it meant breaking your own vow, especially because it meant breaking my own vow. For what is a vow born of hatred worth compared to the life of an innocent child? The moment stretched taut between them, heavy with the weight of confession and the possibility of forgiveness. Then Cochise spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "There will be more violence," he said simply. "There are young warriors among my people who will not accept peace, who see cooperation as betrayal. They will come here seeking to punish those who have chosen a different path." When Seth asked, "Soon, perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow. But they will come." As if summoned by his words, a new sound drifted across the desert, the distant thunder of hoofbeats, many horses moving fast through the darkness. But these weren't the measured pace of cavalry or the careful approach of negotiators. These were war ponies ridden hard by men with violence in their hearts. "They come now," Cochise said sadly. "Led by one called Nietzsche, a young chief who believes that peace is death by another name." "How many?" Tahoma asked, his hand moving to his rifle. 20, perhaps more. Enough to destroy this settlement and everyone in it." The approaching thunder grew louder, accompanied now by the wild cries of warriors preparing for battle. In the distance, Nora could see the flicker of torches, the gleam of weapons in the darkness. "We need to get to town," Seth said urgently. "Warn the others, prepare defenses." "There is no time," Cochise replied. "They will be here before you can reach safety. Your only choice is to stand and fight or to run and die in the desert." Nora looked at Thomas sleeping in her arms, at the men who had been ready to kill each other just moments before, at the harsh landscape that had become their unlikely sanctuary. The choice was simple and terrible: unite or perish. "We fight," she said quietly, surprising everyone, including herself. "We fight together." The attack came with the fury of a desert storm, all wind and sand and deadly intent. Nietzsche's warriors struck the isolated cabin from 3 directions, their war cries splitting the night like breaking glass. Nora crouched behind the thick adobe walls. Thomas clutched to her chest as bullets whined overhead, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Stay down!" Seth shouted, firing through a gap in the shutters. "They're trying to surround us." But Nora could see the truth in the muzzle flashes that bloomed like deadly flowers in the darkness. There were too many attackers, too few defenders. The cabin that had been her refuge was becoming her tomb. A flaming arrow arced through the night, embedding itself in the wooden roof. Then another. Within minutes, the building was burning smoke, filling the air with choking clouds that made breathing an agony. "We can't stay here." Mrs. Green coughed, her rifle still smoking from constant use. "The whole place is going up." "Where do we go?" one of Seth's men demanded. "They've got us surrounded." That's when Tahoma did something that surprised everyone. Instead of seeking cover, he stepped out into the open, his rifle raised above his head. "Apache," he called out in Apache, his voice carrying across the chaos. "I would speak with you." The gunfire slackened, then stopped entirely. In the sudden quiet, a young voice answered from the darkness, harsh, angry, filled with the kind of righteous fury that only the young can sustain. "Tahoma." Nietzsche's voice carried clearly across the burning landscape. "You dare to stand with these white devils. You dare to protect the very people who murdered our children. I dare to stand with those who seek peace over war." Tahoma replied. "I dare to choose mercy over vengeance." "Mercy." Nyacha's laugh was cruel as winter wind. "Was there mercy when they drove us from our lands? Was there mercy when they poisoned our children with their diseases? Was there mercy when they broke every treaty, every promise, every sacred vow?" "No," Tahoma admitted. "There was no mercy then. But there can be mercy now if we choose it. I choose death before dishonor." Nietzsche appeared at the edge of the firelight, mounted on a war horse and painted for battle. He was younger than Tahoma, perhaps 25, with the kind of fierce beauty that spoke of noble blood and ancient grievances. "I choose to die fighting rather than live crawling." "Yeah, and what of the children who will die with you?" What of the mothers who will mourn their sons? Does their pain mean nothing? Their pain means everything. Nietzsche's voice cracked with emotion. It means we must never stop fighting, never stop making the white invaders pay for what they have taken from us. The exchange crystallized everything that divided the two factions. Nietzsche represented the old way, the path of eternal resistance, of dying free rather than living conquered. Tahoma embodied something new and untested, the possibility of adaptation without surrender, of finding honor in survival. Then we are at war, Tahoma said sadly. Not white against red, but past against future. Yes, Nietzsche agreed, and only one can survive. What followed was not a battle between armies, but a duel between philosophies. The two warriors faced each other in the burning light, while their followers watched from positions of cover. It was a scene from the old stories when personal combat could decide the fate of peoples. Nietzsche attacked first, his war cry echoing off the canyon walls as he charged his horse directly at Tahoma. But the older warrior was ready, rolling aside at the last moment and bringing his rifle up in a sweeping arc that caught Nietzsche in the shoulder. The young chief tumbled from his horse, but rolled to his feet with cat-like grace, his knife already in his hand. Blood ran down his arm, but his eyes blazed with undiminished fury. "First blood to the traitor," he snarled. "But last blood will be mine." They circled each other like wolves, each looking for an opening, each knowing that a single mistake would mean death. Nietzsche was younger, faster, driven by the pure fury of ideological conviction. But Tahoma was more experienced, more calculating, tempered by loss and hardened by the weight of command. The knife fight that followed was a deadly dance of steel and shadow. Nietzsche struck like lightning, his blade weaving patterns in the air that would have killed a lesser opponent. But Tahoma was no ordinary warrior. He was a man who had survived decades of warfare, who had learned to read death in his enemy's eyes. When Nietzsche overextended himself with a particularly vicious thrust, Tahoma was ready. His own knife found the young chief's heart with surgical precision, sliding between ribs to pierce the organ that pumped war fire through his veins. Nietzsche fell to his knees, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been understanding. The old ways die hard," he whispered. "Or they die." Tahoma agreed, kneeling beside his fallen enemy. "But they die with honor." The remaining warriors, seeing their leader dead, began to melt away into the darkness. Some surrendered, others simply vanished into the desert night. The immediate threat was over, but the cost had been terrible. As dawn broke over the canyon, revealing the full scope of the destruction, the survivors gathered to count their losses. 3 of Seth's men were dead, along with 5 Apache warriors. The cabin was a burned ruin, its walls still smoking in the morning light. But perhaps the greatest loss was harder to quantify. The death of Nietzsche represented the end of pure Apache resistance, the final defeat of those who believed that death was preferable to change. What now? Seth asked, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. "Now we build something new," Cochise replied. "Something that honors both the dead and the living." "What kind of something?" "A place where Apache and white children can grow up together, where the old hatreds can be buried with the old chiefs. A place where your Thomas can become a bridge between worlds instead of a victim of their collision." Nora looked at her son, who had slept through the entire battle, his innocent face unmarked by the violence that had raged around him. In his peaceful rest, she saw the possibility of a future that neither she nor Tahoma could have imagined when they first faced each other across the chasm of fear and mistrust. "Where?" she asked. "To Copper Ridge," Cochise said. "It will become a place of testing where our peoples learn to live together or die apart. The territorial government will watch, and if we succeed, other communities will follow our example. And if we fail, then the cycle of violence continues, and our children inherit the hatred we could not overcome." The choice was stark and simple. They could return to their separate worlds, nursing their wounds and planning their next conflicts. Or they could take the harder path, building something unprecedented on the foundation of shared loss and mutual need. "I'll go," Nora said finally. "Thomas and I will go to Copper Ridge." "And I will go with you," Tahoma added, "to serve as translator, as mediator, as whatever the peace requires." Seth looked around at his surviving men, reading the decision in their faces. "We'll all go," he said. "Time to try something different." As they prepared to leave the canyon, Nora took one last look at the ruins of the cabin, where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. The sun was rising over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound was answered from across the wasteland. Life, as always, found a way to continue. Copper Ridge had seen nothing like their arrival. The mixed procession of Apache and white, wounded and whole, entered the town in the full heat of midday, with the desert sun beating down like a hammer. Word of the night's violence had preceded them, carried by riders who had witnessed the battle from afar. The crowd that gathered in the main street was a mixture of curiosity and fear, hope and suspicion. These were people who had lived with the threat of Apache raids for years, who had lost friends and family to the ongoing violence. The sight of warriors riding peacefully beside settlers challenged everything they thought they knew about their world. "This is madness," declared Mayor Hutchinson, a thin man whose authority was inversely proportional to his courage. "We can't have savages living among us. It's against nature, against God's will." "God's will." Mrs. Green dismounted from her horse with the stiffness of age and hard travel. "And what do you know of God's will, William Hutchinson? When did the Almighty start speaking through the mouth of a man who's never missed a meal or dodged a bullet?" "I know right from wrong," Hutchinson sputtered. "I know the difference between civilization and barbarism. Do you?" Tahoma stepped forward, his wounded arm bound in a makeshift sling. "Then tell me, civilized man, what is more barbaric, a warrior who kills in battle or a merchant who profits from the suffering of others?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Hutchinson's face reddened, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Maybe we should hear what they have to say before we pass judgment." The speaker was Dr. Harrison, a man whose medical training had taught him to look beyond surface appearances to the deeper truths beneath. He stepped forward with the careful neutrality of one who had treated wounded from both sides of the conflict. "These people have just survived a battle that could have killed them all," he continued. "They chose to fight together instead of dying apart. That seems worth listening to." A murmur ran through the crowd, part agreement, part dissent. But the doctor's words had created a space for conversation, a moment where reason might prevail over fear. "What are you proposing?" asked Mary Collins, a woman whose husband had died in one of the early raids. Her question carried the weight of personal loss, but also the faint hope of finding meaning in tragedy. "We're proposing an experiment," Seth said, stepping forward to speak for the group. "A chance to see if Apache and White can live together without killing each other. A chance to build something better than the cycle of violence that's consumed us all. And if it doesn't work..." This from Tom Hutchins, a rancher who had lost his son to raiders. His voice carried the harsh edge of grief still fresh. "If they turn on us in the night, if they lead other bands to attack us, then we'll die," Tahoma said simply. "But we'll die having tried something worthy, instead of living in fear of something inevitable." The brutal honesty of the answer seemed to satisfy something in the crowd. These were frontier people accustomed to straight talk and hard choices. They might not like the options, but they respected those who faced them honestly. "What about the children?" The question came from Sarah Collins, Mary's 8-year-old daughter. "Will the Apache children go to our school?" "If their parents wish it," Nora replied, kneeling to address the child directly. "And if white children are willing to learn from Apache teachers as well." "What could they teach us?" Sarah asked with the innocent curiosity of youth. How to find water in the desert. Tahoma said, his scarred face softening as he spoke to the child. How to read the signs of weather and season. How to live with the land instead of fighting against it. That sounds useful, Sarah said pragmatically. Mama says useful things are usually worth learning. The child's simple acceptance seemed to break something loose in the crowd. If an 8-year-old could see the possibilities instead of just the dangers, perhaps the adults could as well. Dr. Harrison stepped forward again, his voice carrying the authority of education and experience. The territorial government has been looking for ways to establish peaceful relations with the Apache tribes. Having a successful integration here could serve as a model for the entire region. Or it could get us all killed, Hutchinson muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. We're already being killed, Mary Collins said quietly. My husband's dead. The Morrison family's gone. The Hendersons, too. At what point do we admit that fighting isn't working? Her words struck home because they came from someone who had every right to demand vengeance. If a woman who had lost her husband to Apache raiders could consider peace, perhaps peace was possible. Over the following days, a strange new rhythm began to emerge in Copper Ridge. Tahoma took up residence in a small house on the edge of town, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough to avoid constant confrontation with those who still viewed him with suspicion. His first official act as territorial Indian agent was to establish regular meetings between Apache and white leaders' sessions designed to prevent the kinds of misunderstandings that had led to violence in the past. These gatherings were tense affairs, filled with awkward silences and carefully chosen words, but they were a beginning. Nora found herself at the center of many of these discussions, her unique experience making her valuable as a translator of more than just language. She understood the fears and hopes of both communities, having lived at the intersection of their worlds. Thomas, meanwhile, adapted with the remarkable flexibility of childhood. He played with Apache and white children with equal enthusiasm, switching between languages as easily as changing games. His innocent acceptance of difference became a kind of silent teaching for the adults around him. But not everyone embraced the new arrangements. A core group of settlers led by Hutchinson and supported by several ranchers who had lost family to raids continued to oppose what they saw as dangerous appeasement. The opposition crystallized around a man named Jake Morrison, brother to the family that had been killed in the original raid. He was a hard man, made harder by loss, and he viewed every Apache face as a reminder of his murdered kin. They killed my brother's children, he said during one heated town meeting. Burned them alive in their own home, and now we're supposed to welcome their killers with open arms. The men who killed your family are dead, Tahoma replied quietly. I killed some of them myself during the battle at the canyon. The blood debt has been paid. Who has it? How do I know you weren't one of the raiders? How do I know you didn't pull the trigger that killed my nephew? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Tahoma met Morrison's eyes without flinching, his voice steady when he replied. You don't know. You must choose to trust or choose to remain forever at war with shadows. Trust. Morrison's laugh was bitter as alkali water. Trust the word of a savage who admits to killing white men. I have killed in war, Tahoma agreed. As have you. As did your brother fighting to protect his family. The question is not whether we have blood on our hands, but what we choose to do with the time we have left. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by news that changed everything. A rider arrived from the territorial capital with word that a large band of Apache warriors was moving south from the San Carlos reservation, reportedly heading toward Copper Ridge. How many? Seth asked, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. 50, maybe 60, the messenger replied. Led by a chief called Victorio. They're not painting for war, but they're armed and moving with purpose. Cochise, who had remained in the area to observe the integration experiment, received the news with troubled eyes. Victorio is old school, he said quietly. He believes in the traditional ways in settling disputes through strength rather than words. What does he want? Nora asked Thomas, heavy in her arms, as the afternoon heat made him drowsy. To test us, Tahoma replied. To see if this peace we've built is real or just another white man's lie wrapped in pretty words. The test came 3 days later when Victorio's band arrived at the outskirts of Copper Ridge. The old chief was exactly what Nora had expected, tall, dignified, and radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of command. His warriors were disciplined and well-armed, but they made no hostile moves as they established a camp just outside the town limits. Victorio requested a meeting with the town leaders, and what followed was perhaps the strangest negotiation in Arizona Territory history. Apache and white sat together in the town hall, their weapons laid aside but not forgotten while their children played in the street outside. I have come to see this thing you have built. Victorio said, his English more formal than Tahoma's, but equally clear. This place where the wolf lies down with the lamb. We're not wolves or lambs, Seth replied. We're just people trying to make the best of a bad situation. Then are you people who have forgotten what they are in service of a dream that cannot last? The question cut to the heart of everyone's deepest fears. Were they really building something lasting, or were they simply delaying an inevitable reckoning? Time will tell, Cochise said diplomatically. But what harm is there in trying? The harm, Victorio replied, is in the children who grow up believing that compromise is strength, that adaptation is survival. What happens when the next crisis comes? What happens when the government decides that treaties are inconvenient? What happens when the white settlers decide they want more land, more resources, more control? His words carried the weight of bitter experience. This was a man who had seen every promise broken, every treaty violated, every gesture of peace turned into an opportunity for exploitation. What happens, Tahoma said quietly, is that we face those challenges together instead of separately. What happens is that we have allies instead of enemies when the next test comes. And if your allies abandon you, if they choose their own people over their promises to you, then we will have tried, Nora said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. We will have shown our children that peace is possible, even if we couldn't make it permanent. Victorio studied her face with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires. You are the white woman who was saved by Apache mercy. I am a mother who was saved by human kindness, Nora corrected. The color of the hands that helped me mattered less than their willingness to act. And your child, what will you teach him about his place in this world? Nora looked at Thomas, who was awake now, and watching the proceedings with the bright curiosity of early childhood. I'll teach him to judge people by their actions rather than their appearance, to see differences as opportunities for learning rather than reasons for fighting. Unnoble words. But what if he is rejected by both peoples? What if he is too white for the Apache, too Apache for the whites? What if your grand experiment leaves him belonging nowhere? The question struck at Nora's deepest fear, that in trying to build bridges, she might be condemning her son to a life of perpetual exile. But as she looked around the room at Apache and white faces united in common concern, she found her answer. Then he'll help build a place where people like him can belong, she said. A place where the question isn't whether you're white or Apache, but whether you're willing to work for something better than what came before. Victorio nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. We will see. I will remain here for 1 moon, watching how this experiment unfolds. If it shows strength, my people will consider joining it. If it shows weakness, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the stakes. The month that followed was like living under a microscope, with every interaction between Apache and white scrutinized for signs of success or failure. Victorio's warriors maintained their camp outside town, polite but watchful, ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. The test came in an unexpected form. Little Sarah Collins, playing near the Apache camp, was bitten by a rattlesnake. The venom acted quickly, and by the time she was brought to Dr. Harrison, she was already unconscious. "I need anti-venom," the doctor said grimly. "But the nearest supply is in Tucson, 3 days' ride." She doesn't have 3 days. That's when one of Victorio's warriors stepped forward. "We have medicine," he said in halting English. "Old medicine, traditional medicine. It might help." The offer created a crisis of trust. Western medicine said the child would die without proper antivenom. Apache medicine offered an unproven alternative. The choice belonged to Mary Collins, Sarah's mother, and everyone waited to see what she would decide. "Use it," she said without hesitation. "If my daughter is going to die anyway, at least let her die knowing that people tried to save her." What followed was a tense vigil as Apache healers worked alongside Dr. Harrison, combining traditional remedies with modern medical knowledge. For 12 hours, Sarah hovered between life and death, while the entire community held its breath. When she finally opened her eyes, weak but alive, something fundamental shifted in the relationship between the two communities. Here was proof that cooperation could literally mean the difference between life and death. Victorio watched these events with the calculating eyes of a man who had learned to read the deeper currents of human nature. When the month was up, he called for another meeting. "I have seen enough," he announced. "This thing you have built, it is not perfect, but it is real. It is not permanent, but it is possible." He paused, his ancient eyes taking in the mixed crowd before him. "Some of my people will stay here to learn and to teach. Others will return to the reservation with word of what they have seen." "And you?" Cochise asked his old friend. "I am too old to change, too set in my ways to adapt. But I am not too old to recognize courage when I see it." Victorio's gaze found Nora in the crowd. "Your son will grow up in a world I cannot imagine, shaped by forces I do not understand. But he will not grow up alone." As autumn settled over the desert, bringing with it the crisp air and brilliant sunsets that made the harsh landscape briefly beautiful, the changes in Copper Ridge became more pronounced. The school expanded to accommodate both Apache and white children. The church began holding services that incorporated elements from both traditions. The trading post became a meeting place where different cultures could interact safely and profitably. But perhaps the most significant change was less visible: the gradual erosion of the fear that had once divided the community. Children who had learned to play together were growing into young adults who saw past racial differences to individual character. Families that had learned to trust each other during crises were forming genuine friendships that transcended cultural boundaries. Tahoma's role evolved as well. No longer just a mediator between worlds, he became a teacher and counselor, helping others navigate the complex process of cultural adaptation. His office in the territorial building became a place where disputes were resolved through conversation rather than violence. Nora found her calling as well, becoming the community's unofficial ambassador between cultures. Her experience as a bridge between worlds made her invaluable when misunderstandings arose, or when new families, both Apache and white, arrived in town. One evening in late autumn, as she sat on her porch watching Thomas play with a group of mixed-race children, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with desperation and near death, with a dying child and a bucket of sandy water. It had led through betrayal and violence, through impossible choices and unexpected alliances. But it had ended here, in this imperfect but genuine community, surrounded by evidence of what could be accomplished when people chose hope over hatred. Tahoma joined her on the porch, as had become his custom in the evening hours. His wounded arm had healed, but it would never regain its full strength, a permanent reminder of the price he had paid for peace. "Do you ever wonder what Daniel would think of this place?" he asked, watching the children play their elaborate games that borrowed rules from both cultures. "Sometimes," Nora admitted. "I think he would be amazed that it worked. He always believed in grand dreams, but he never had the patience to build them properly. Perhaps that was his gift to you, the ability to dream large enough to encompass this." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded their valley. In the distance, they could hear the evening sounds of a thriving community. Families calling children in for supper dogs, barking their ancient songs at the gentle murmur of conversation from neighboring porches. "What do you think will happen when Thomas grows up?" Tahoma asked. "What kind of man will he become?" Nora smiled, watching her son help a younger Apache child reach a ball that had gotten stuck in a tree. "I think he'll become the kind of man who sees problems as opportunities to help others, who judges people by their character rather than their appearance, who understands that differences can be strengths when we choose to see them that way. And if he faces hatred, if there are those who can never accept what he represents, then he'll have the tools to respond with understanding rather than anger, the wisdom to build bridges instead of walls." As winter approached, bringing with it the need for communities to work together for survival, Copper Ridge faced its first real test as an integrated society. Food needed to be stored, fuel gathered, preparations made for the harsh months ahead. The work required cooperation on a scale that had never been attempted. But the community rose to the challenge. Apache knowledge of desert survival combined with white agricultural techniques to create a system that was stronger than either could have achieved alone. Families shared resources across cultural lines. Children from both communities learned skills from elders of all backgrounds. When spring returned, painting the desert in brief but brilliant colors, the success of the experiment was undeniable. Copper Ridge had not just survived, it had thrived. The territorial government took notice, and similar programs began appearing throughout the region. Thomas celebrated his 4th birthday that spring with a party that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Apache and white children played together in the street while their parents shared food and stories. Gifts came from both communities. Traditional toys carved from desert wood, books written in multiple languages, clothes that blended the practical needs of frontier life with the artistic traditions of different cultures. But perhaps the most meaningful gift came from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison, the man who had been among the harshest critics of integration, approached Nora during the celebration. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his weathered face showing the strain of a man wrestling with his own prejudices. "And I owe him my thanks." He gestured toward Tahoma, who was helping children organize a game that seemed to involve elements from both Apache and white traditions. "Why?" Nora asked, genuinely curious. "Because he saved my daughter's life last month when she got lost in the desert. Tracked her for 2 days, brought her home safe. Didn't ask for anything in return, didn't make speeches about peace and understanding. Just did what needed doing." Morrison paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man more accustomed to action than reflection. "I've been carrying around a lot of anger," he continued. "Anger at the Apache, anger at God, anger at myself for not being able to protect my family. But anger's a heavy load, and I'm tired of carrying it." "What changed your mind?" "Watching him with the children. Apache kids, white kids, doesn't matter to him. He treats them all the same, teaches them all the same lessons. My daughter came home from one of his classes knowing how to find north by the stars, how to find water by reading the land. Those are gifts, not threats." The conversation was interrupted by Thomas, who ran up to show off a wooden horse that one of the Apache children had given him. The toy was carved with traditional designs, but painted in bright colors that reflected the influence of white artistic traditions. "Look, Mama," Thomas said in his mixture of English and Apache. "Isn't it beautiful?" "Yes, sweetheart." Nora replied, her heart full. as she watched her son embrace the gift with the unconscious acceptance of a child who had never known a world divided by race. It's very beautiful. As the celebration continued into the evening, marked by storytelling and music that drew from both traditions, Nora found herself thinking about the future. What would Thomas's world look like when he became a man? What challenges would he face? What opportunities would be available to him? The answers were unknowable, but the foundation they were building here would shape whatever came next. A generation of children was growing up believing that cooperation was normal, that differences were interesting rather than threatening, that problems were best solved through understanding rather than violence. It wasn't perfect, nothing involving human beings ever was. There were still misunderstandings, still moments of tension, still people on both sides who harbored old grudges. But it was better than what had come before, and it offered hope for something even better in the future. As the evening wound down and families began to head home, Tahoma approached Nora with a small wrapped package. "For Thomas," he said simply. "A birthday gift from one who has watched him grow into a bridge between worlds." Inside the package was a book handmade with pages of carefully prepared paper, bound in soft leather. The text was written in both English and Apache, telling the story of their community's founding from both perspectives. "And so he'll know where he came from," Tahoma explained. "And so he'll understand the choices that were made to give him the world he's inheriting." Nora opened the book to the first page where an inscription read, "For Thomas Walsh, child of two worlds, citizen of both, belonging fully to the future we are building together." As she read the words, Nora felt tears gathering in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperate cries of a dying infant to the laughter of children who saw no barriers between cultures, they had traveled farther than she had ever imagined possible. The desert wind whispered through the streets of Copper Ridge, carrying with it the sense of sage and possibility. In houses throughout the town, families of all backgrounds settled into their evening routines, secure in the knowledge that they were part of something unprecedented and precious. And in a small house on the edge of town, a mother sat reading to her son from a book that told the story of how enemies became friends, how hatred became understanding, how the simple act of feeding a starving child had grown into something that might change the world. Thomas fell asleep in her lap as she read, his small hand clutching the wooden horse. His dreams filled with the possibilities of a world where difference was celebrated rather than feared. In his innocent rest lay the future of everything they had built, fragile as desert flowers after rain, but rooted in soil that had been nourished by sacrifice and watered by hope. Outside, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow blessing this small corner of the desert where people had learned to see past the color of skin to the commonality of hope. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything they had dared to dream, and everything the next generation would inherit.